Thus, networking structures are often promoted as being highly cosmopolitan. They're championed for how they accommodate self-styled independent actors whose movements and decision-making are supposedly less embedded in and dictated by structure and context. Thus, the importance of network structures today is how they accommodate these free agents who come together and exchange without necessarily sharing common cause, or class, or history, or ideology, but who are rather only ever loosely affiliated within a dispersed field, who through being disembedded perhaps suffer social undercommitment, but for that very reason gain much greater entree to more far-flung and disparate circuits of potentially valuable data. It's because of this kind of cosmopolitan character or effect of the network system that you can find people today who boast of being both an insider and DIY at the same time. Now, if this is all true, if indeed networks entail an expansion of agency, then it's tempting to speculate about the relationship between this rise of network structures that I've been describing and another phenomenon that's characterized art of the last 20 years, which is the return of practice. And this brings us back to the recent state of sculpture shows. The catalog for the Thing Show at the Hammer noticeably includes photographs of the artist's studios, which is really old school, right? Going back to kind of the old art news, so-and-so paints a picture, pictorials that they used to run. And they stopped running in the later 60s because everybody was making fun of romanticizing the studio. So not only is the studio back, but if you look at the catalog of Thing, it also situates the entire exhibition in relationship to an essay by Libby Lumpkin called The Redemption of Practice. This essay, which Lumpkin published in 1997, elaborates on an argument that was also being made by her husband, Dave Hickey, at the time, that denounces postmodern or post-conceptual theory-based art that supposedly dominated the mid to early 1980s. Lumpkin applauds, quote, how artists are making things again, but late 80s works asserting their materiality have trickled into galleries on the coasts, and now, everywhere you look, there are objects that come in substances, colors, shapes, and sizes that matter, end quote. Here, theory as a category is claimed to have had itself a kind of dictatorial and paralyzing effect on artistic agency or practice in the early 80s. And beyond that, the contents of that theory, the narratives that often told, were likewise about paralysis, only writ large on the level of philosophy, history, and all of society. One variant of that theory that was popular back then told the story of how the individual had ceded autonomy in inverse proportion to the assumption of power by the media. The commodity was taken as an emblem of that transfer of autonomy. The commodity, as it stood static behind glass, was no longer a material thing, but an image for display. More than that, it was a sign of a thing, and it acted in concert with all other commodity signs to form a sovereign language. Much art in the 1980s picture society is constituted by, or at least living in the shadow of, such an all-encompassing structure, what was variously called consumer culture, or spectacle, or ideology, or just the text. Employed as theory's opposite term, practice is said to emphasize individual concrete acts, their specific materiality and temporality, all of which are supposed to defy the sweeping, abstract, and static totalizations of dominant systems. Looked at through the lens of practice, culture is thought of as no longer distant or autonomous, no longer based on display and passive decoding assigned by powerless initiates. Rather, culture based on practice is thought to be executed by individuals in and through material things and situations. One of the artists Lumpkin might have been thinking of when she wrote her essay, an artist whose work had indeed trickled into galleries in the late 80s and early 90s, and which, as Lumpkin puts it, was more about inventing than appropriating, is Jessica Stockholder. Here, appropriation is folded into bricolage, or what Levi-Strauss had called the science of the concrete. Bricolage is a word used incessantly in the catalog of the New Museum's Unmonumental Show. where it signifies agency and an invention through material heterogeneity. It refers to the handling, adapting, and piecing together of concrete things. This marks a dramatic shift since a decade before stockholders' appearance, heterogeneity had signaled something like channel surfing schizophrenia in David Sally's paintings. By the early 90s, though, with the emergence of network structures and the communication paradigm I've been talking about, suddenly the throwing together of disparate things stood for a healthy and welcoming capaciousness, such as in Laura Owens' canvases, right, as if she was undertaking painting the way one might collect records, as a cultural or even subcultural practice. This is like painting as if assisted by a Google search engine. Or compare early 80s media appropriations by artists like Richard Prince to Elizabeth Peyton's later renderings of celebrities. Or compare Barbara Kruger's media scripts with the handwritten pedestrian communiques facilitated by Gillian Waring. Or more simply, juxtapose Peter Halley from 1983 when he was quoting Baudrillard to Halley in 1996 when he's publishing Index magazine, this issue of Index. Let's see, where are we? Oh, there we go. Okay, that's Kruger and Gillian Waring. This is early Peter Halley and then Halley's Index magazine from 1996. This particular issue featuring a cover photograph by Wolfgang Tillman. In work from the early 1990s by Mike Kelly and Jim Shaw, shopping segued into thrifting. With Wolfgang Tillman's, thrifting turned fashion into street fashion. Here I think you find again an instance of what I was earlier describing as de-differentiation. This work isn't just about production, or at least the model of artistic practice that it foregrounds doesn't exactly conform with the stereotype of the lone genius who transmutes raw material in the isolation of her and his studio. And yet, the kind of consumption that it entails is not meant to be passive. Rather, it's about intervening in everyday materials that are themselves interwoven and continuous with larger communities and cultures. In a lot of recent art, including all the sculpture shows I've been talking about, this de-differentiated model of practice is often exemplified through thrifting. So this is a shot of the show by Jim Shaw called Thrift Store Painting from 1992 at Metro Pictures in New York, which is hugely influential. This is work from the early 90s by the artist Christian Marclay, who says that he never spent more than $1 on any of the albums, the covers of which he uses for these projects. Here are more used records. This is a watercolor by Dave Muller on the left, and a piece from On Monumental by John Bach, where he seems to be pulling out an album, an old used record, out of its sleeve. This then is an instance of what the theorist, curator Nicola Borio has famously called post-production, whereby, quote, artists who insert their work into that of others contribute to the eradication of the traditional distinction between production and consumption, creation and copy, ready-made and original work, end quote. All of which is to say that the former antithesis, pitting creative hero against conformist consumer, is here shown to be de-differentiated or even transcended in the figure of the artist as bricoleur. But I think it's possible to be even more specific about the site of production that's being conjured by the new sculpture. To go back to stockholder, as well as artists like Katie Nolan and Karen Kalimnik, who also began showing at the same time and who were obviously just as big an influence on the new sculpture, their innovation was not so much to bring back or redeem practice, as Lumpkin claims, but to reintroduce process into the sculptural vocabulary of the late 80s.